So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for inviting me. Thanks a lot for having the opportunity to say a bit about complexity in peace processes. And what I can really do, and I can't do much more, I guess, is to situate this discourse of complexity a bit. Where does this sit in this kind of peace-building debate in a broader way? And what might it tell us? And as has been said, I'm using research we did at the Political Settlements Research Program, which is funded by the UK Department for International Development, which is important, I have to say that really. And this peace agreements database we have there, which consists of all peace agreements that have been signed and published since 1990. So we have a number of about 1,600 peace agreements that tell you, in a way, a story of peace processes in a comparative way. So I'd like to start with reminding ourselves what we still have quite often in mind in terms of the linear story of peace, as I want to call it. And this is the famous conflict curve. And whereas we all kind of know that it doesn't work that way, we still have, in a way, we look always for this kind of curve, in a way. Okay, we start with prevention beginning. If it doesn't work out, we have kind of the crisis management phase, kind of the hot conflict phase. And then we all look for this downward trend and how we can support that. And this thinking in terms of this conflict curve leads to questions like, what is the ideal peace process design? How we could do good sequencing? Where is the choreography? So, and when to do elections? We have this question, for example, right now in Sudan at the moment. When do it early, do it later? So these questions of institutionalization before liberalization, or should we do elections before further institutionalization? All these kinds of questions are very much part of this thinking of where to sit, this sits in this kind of curve. But the question is really, is there something like such a choreography? And for that, I want to show you more like I would call it the complex story of peace, which is, I'll move over to this here, which shows you along the agreement types where peace processes unfold and how these look like. Because this is the kind of real conflict curve, just looking at agreements from ceasefires, pre-negotiation agreements, these big comprehensive agreements and implementation in the middle. And if you move over here, you see basically, and the only message here really is to see that all these peace processes look completely different, and there's no real trend, trajectory, or the ideal type kind of sequence you could find. So I have to go back here. How do we deal with that? And I think, like in contemporary, I'm myself coming from research, and if you are into peace-building research for a longer time, it is basically a history of failure all along, which is a bit different from the practitioner's angle. People working more in mediation to have successes all the time, but in a way for us it's always like a history of failure. So why we understand this kind of obvious trend, there is no clear trajectories, why we understand that as failures. And I think this has a lot to do with how we understand ourselves in the kind of project, in the big project of building peace or debating peace. And this has a lot to do with the vision of state building that dominated basically the 1990s and 2000s, where we kind of knew, okay, there is a state, this is what we want to build, because we know in the OECD world it works like this, and we do it. We heard this before with the example of Ethiopia, that doesn't kind of, this very kind of prescriptive approach is not taking into account the contextual conditions in which peace building often goes. And then we had like a turn and a shift, and I think this is already kind of canonized in our thinking, a shift to context, a shift that we have to take into account that it doesn't work everywhere the same. It has been debated as a local turn, as a question for contextuality, but still, and this is the main claim I want to make, this idea of contextuality, this idea of bringing local in, is still embedded in this linear type of thinking, because we still think, okay, we need more knowledge. If we understand more and better how things work, then we might do better peace in the end. But the question is, and I think this is really the starting point for the discussion we have today, there's a certain limit to knowledge. The more we know, the less we know. And the more data we have, the more non-knowledge we create. And I've seen that kind of myself when working with for example, different conflict advisors, when they bring in all anthropologists telling them about kind of conflict situations, they're sitting there completely overmatched. This is knowledge you can't process. There's no good way to create better knowledge out of this. So we have to deal with, and I think this is the main starting point of the complexity discussion. We have to accept that there is the condition of non-knowledge, and the more data we produce, the more we know that we don't know. This is in a way a bit the curve I showed you before. So we have, I think, to ask ourselves, why is this idea of kind of linear peacemaking still so present, why it is so persistent? I think I mentioned before, like this inventing tradition of this ideal type statehood, as if the state has worked so well all over history, which is in fact, if you remind ourselves, a very short kind of period of time that we have kind of working statehood. And this period was, before that, very, very violent. So this working statehood, as we know it, comes out of the probably most violent processes that we have seen in the history of mankind. So this invented tradition of this kind of well-working kind of statehood in the peaceful way towards this statehood, this is one thing that is present. But I want to go more, and I think this is for our discussion more relevant, into something which I would call kind of this bit liberal trias of peacemaking, which is three different but very related forms or modes of how we achieve often also dialogue processes. That is, looking for solutions, then focus on implementation, and by relating people, by bringing everybody or everything together in national dialogue processes. Let's go into the details. So this is, and start with the idea of solutions. We all know the story of the root causes of conflict. And there is behind that also the story that if we address or first identify root causes properly and then address them properly in agreements, this might lead to better, more sustainable peace. It's like this kind of graph from the United Nations. You have like all these underlying issues, be it poverty, be it like suppression of identities, whatever. However, what we know from agreements, the debate about root causes is nothing else quite often than the debate about the main lines of contestation of the conflict itself. If we remind ourselves in Colombia, is the Colombian, like we had this in the recent negotiations, and this was kind of a broad-based public debate as well. If the Colombian peace process and between the government and FARC, is this about drugs, or is it about land rights, or is it about both? What they then did was writing a comprehensive agreement where all these issues came kind of together, like just dragged together. You have kind of a chapter on land rights, you have a chapter on drugs and kind of illicit kind of economic activities. But we have to take into account that at the very moment we talk about root causes, we have, and this is kind of the complexity thing coming in there, a big feedback loop that this whole debate becomes part again of the conflict. So there is nothing like objective root causes we can address to solve things. The second element is implementation. And we see here, this is a highly interesting project, by the way, by the Kroc Institute, which traces comprehensive peace agreements in terms of their rate of implementation. So you see here, like this agreement, 83% implemented, all these kinds of things. The story behind that, and this is basically the story which is pretty much dominating still, is a peace agreement, whatever kind of settlement, is the better, the more thorough it gets implemented. Because as we all kind of know the story, if we don't implement certain provisions, they kind of are persistent and permanently present trigger factors for the next potential uprising. Now the interesting thing is, if you look into processes more clearly or more deeply, then you see that quite often non-implementation plays an as important role as implementation for the process. For example, I've just looked once up the numbers of referenda, which is one usual kind of element, which comes up in national dialogues now and then you set it at some stage in the process. Abyei is one example in between Sudan and South Sudan, where there was kind of referendum scheduled at the same time as the independence referendum. Was held years later without any for the implication. This is not unusual. 80% of the referenda, at least 80, are either postponed, like severely postponed over decades at times, or never implemented. The question is this a bad thing? Or does this happen by a certain kind of reason? Not really, but at least logic. Because this logic enables parties to stick to their default positions without giving up their default positions, but at the same time keeping a process ongoing. So it might be that implementation can hamper a process as well as it can support it. So we never really know how it works. And the third idea is the idea of relation. We have still like in mind, and I think this very much refers to this idea of national dialogues, this idea, okay, bring like everybody into the room, bring all issues together, bring all actors together, be as inclusive as possible. And I think we have heard before in the first panel that this is actually a very difficult thing. I was very astounded by the question that came, which was completely impossible like 10 years ago. How do we keep kind of disgruntled elites involved in an inclusive process? Very interesting that this question comes. Usually it is asked the other way around. How do we make elites more open to inclusive problems or inclusive approaches and processes? Now, what we see, however, in terms of this idea of relation, peace as relation, and peace as relating all types of actors, is that we see two historical trends really over the last 25 years. And the one thing is that these comprehensive peace deals, these big kind of ideal type national level deals that address all types of problems, are decreasing. They're still signed in a way, not as often as in the mid-2000s, and they have hardly ever had the success as they had, if you could argue that, in countries such as Nepal. There was a certain heyday in the mid-2000s, but from them it went down. On the other hand, what we see is an increasing number of written, really formally negotiated local or subnational peace deals that are emerging, really. And for example, like I know that the British Stabilization Unit did one research in Syria on that. They found about 45 to 50 really substantial subnational agreements that are written, that are have all kinds of things what we would expect from peace agreements, but on a local way. So we see perhaps a shift in how kind of peacemaking unfolds from this kind of national level dialogue thing down to a more messy, unclear process across different levels and layers, involving different actors and also different actor combinations, because we would see international actors coming in and negotiating local agreements as well. So it's kind of, it's not necessarily layered in a classical sense. So what does this tell us in terms of our topic of complexity? And I think that the most important kind of more or less obvious thing is it's pretty unpredictable. So we have this messiness, and this messiness is going to stay probably. But as important is, and this is the point I want to stress, we see from these relations between implementation, non-implementation, solutions, non-solutions, that the very same measure that we take, or the very same process of institutionalization that kind of unfolds, can have different parallel implications, even contradicting ones. We used, when thinking about that, we used the example of funny enough, the British Constitution, which is in a way very interesting in that regard, because it's a non-written constitution, and it's in a way a constitutional unsettlement, because the British Constitution is not settled. There's lots of gray areas in between, especially with devolution coming in and parts of Scotland and Wales permanently negotiating their place or in the Union. And the question is this a good or bad thing? Should this be written down? Should this be kind of clear to the last kind of thing? Or do we need this fluidity? Do we need the gray space to keep things together? And the answer is probably both. This is the problem here. This is the very same process that keeps the thing together, because if we would kind of define everything, it would kind of be blown apart. But at the same time, these processes get drawn apart by being not clearly set. So this is the thing of these contradicting parallel effects we have to deal with. And I think, like, I won't go into details into that, but we have already kind of thought about that in research for quite some time with different kinds of labels, call it hybridity, called it compromised peace building. So there's always kind of a compromise going on. You never know in which kind of way this would pan out. We have the idea of formalized political unsettlement, that we can't really settle on all issues in these processes. So what emerged over the last years, and I think this is now going into what we're really discussing, is several complexity approaches that kind of come without us being kind of us in the sense of all these types we were discussing before, really being aware that these are actually answers to this complexity. The first thing would be modeling, complexity modeling, which is for some reason not really that common in our kind of sphere. It is basically very common within US military. So I know they do that. They do complexity modeling in terms of their conflict analysis. And if you have seen, like for Afghanistan, for example, they took away now their counting of kind of who owns what in terms of territory, which was argued by, okay, they approach this conflict now from a completely different angle because of their way of modeling these conflicts. So this is more like in the military popular. We have a turn to process management. And I think we heard a lot about inclusion now, and I think my personal take is why inclusion becomes so important in the whole peace-building debate over the last 10 years almost now, is because it focuses on process. It doesn't tell us too much about outcomes. It doesn't tell us too much about how to do what at what kind of certain type, but this is more like a process, a broad process principle along the lines that also kind of chime with the resilience approach, that a more diverse process tends to be more sustainable. And we have as a second kind of element the management of effects, really. And here's resilience coming in as an approach that looks at what is actually happening on the ground and looks at peace and problems of violent conflict from the impact level, and looks then also like at the systems consequences these impacts have. So what could we do to make people more adaptive to these adversities they have to face when being in complex crises or situations of complex crises? So just to rush through, there are pitfalls here. This is not a panacea of how to do things better. This modeling process has the big issue that I'm highly skeptical that we just can do the whatever good model and then predict how these complex relations between people actually would pan out. So it's not the same as modeling the climate, and the modeling the climate is difficult enough. So I'm highly skeptical if this is kind of working. Then we have to be aware of the risk of relinearization. So is it, and we had heard it before, it's kind of, is more inclusion really lead to a better peace? I don't think we can know that, to be honest. And we have to be aware that, especially within inclusion, but also within resilience-based approaches, politics won't go away. There is power, and there is, in inclusive processes, this is a highly power-related process of who gets in, who gets out. Inclusion always creates exclusion as well. And it's also always the question of how to incentivize inclusive processes. So what are the consequences of this? As said, messiness might not be the exception, it is probably the rule we have to deal with. And we might be well advised to unlearn a lot of these kind of models that we have in mind in terms of linear peacemaking. But I think the most important consequence, and this refers particularly to the idea of inclusive dialogues, is that we have to think in terms of trade-offs, really. And trade-offs is it elite inclusion versus kind of broader societal things? Is it whatever topics to include? How it's not all good things might go together. There's a clear kind of problem. We bring armed actors in, be inclusive. Okay, we set the incentive to take up arms to get included. This is a process we see in several parts of the world ongoing, like in the DRC, for example. So we have here a permanent problem, and we have to take into account that there's no clear-cut way out. And there is the second kind of issue with this. Where's the visions? Where's the norms? Where's the hope? What we are actually striving for? Can we strive still for something more than just whatever dull conflict management, which was a term which was highly unpopular over years? So we worked over the last years, a lot with the idea of principled pragmatism. So where do norms come in? So where is kind of the positionality for the people involved in these processes, for the people externally supporting these? Is it like an everything goes in terms of norms? Or how are we all in our kind of different roles ourselves in these processes? And I guess it's more the question of striking a balance. It's a navigation thing, not giving away and not accepting everything, but on the same hand, not being dogmatic. I think the second opportunity is the embracing of these complex transitions, and I think this is for national dialogues particularly important, as there is no kind of set level that it has to go that way. It's a more kind of open framework. And I think with what I've talked before about this different levels and this different kind of messiness that comes out of this more local peace processes, it's important to have tools available of people who want to come together and talk, but also like not bringing them all into some formalized kind of framework that has to lead to a certain outcome, or is a failure. I think in terms of agreements, it's also important what we want to pin down, and I think here the trend shows more that it is advisable to be more humble. So perhaps like rethink the idea of this broad, comprehensive peace agreements as the ideal type outcome of whatever process. So we had heard this before, like a national dialogue leads then ideally to the perfect constitution. Yeah, but unlikely. And I think the final thing, and this goes also for people negotiating this, but also for people involved in process support, I think there's a lot of risk-taking involved, and we called that idea like hooks, taking more a hooks-based approach of perhaps suggesting things or negotiating things into agreements that might be helpful at some point down the road. You never know, but a reference to human rights might help. You never know, but the Police Reform Commission might help. But we can't know beforehand what types of elements will become important within a broader process of transitions. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, and we are a bit ill-equipped to do this at the moment. Thank you.